When I was 7 years old, I asked my mom, "Mommy, how do you make a baby?" And she wouldn't answer me. And I kept coming back to her over and over again until finally one day, when she was ironing in the laundry room, she grabbed me, she picked me up, she put me on the washing machine, and she ironed, and she told me about the birds and the bees. Well, when she finished, I jumped down and ran out to play. The next day, I came up to her again and said, "Mommy, how do you make a baby?" And she said, "Oh my goodness, Gary Allen, I've already told you that. I'm not telling you again." Then in exasperation, I looked at her and said, "Well, one day I'm gonna get married and my wife's gonna say, 'Gary Allen, let's have a baby.' And I'm gonna say, 'I don't know how.'" Now I'm married, my wife and I have 3 kids. Suffice it to say, we did figure it out. But the problem is now my kids are coming to me with the same questions. As we've wrestled with how we want to talk about this with our kids, we've come up with 4 key principles. First, we've talked about it organically, or as the situation has simply come up with each child. Instead of forcing it, we simply try to answer their questions when they come to us. Next, we try to keep it scientific. We use scientific terms like penis or vagina. We're not doing them any favors by coming up with nicknames, because that sometimes can lead to shame. And then third, we bring it all back to God. We tell our kids that God made sex, He made it good, and He made it for a specific context. And finally, unlike my mom, we don't try to download everything to them at once. We talk about it incrementally.
While we don't agree with everything in sex, God, and the conservative church, we love this quote from Dr. Sellers. To put it simply, children and adolescents do not need one 100-minute awkward and painful sexual health conversation. They need 100 one-minute conversations. They need sexual and relational education delivered in many, many sound bites, weekly, across their entire childhood and teen years.
Sometimes younger kids are curious and they may initiate these conversations on their own. But if they're not, it may be because they feel like it isn't a safe topic to bring up. Maybe they tried once before and were criticized. Especially if that's the case, saying things like, "You can talk to me about anything, right?" may not be enough. As the founder of porn recovery group XXX Church put it, your kids will talk to you about the things you talk to them about. Your kids won't talk to you about things you don't talk to them about.
So with that, welcome back to the Sex Talk 2.0 free video series. In this video, we're gonna give you the second and third heart postures. To recap, the first heart posture is that God's design for sex is fundamentally good. Everything we talk about in this video will build on that foundation and help prepare you for these conversations.
Maybe you've heard the phrase, what one generation accepts, the next generation assumes, and the next generation rejects. The assuming generation trusts that the accepting generation did their work to come up with the right answer, but they may not know how to articulate how or why they got that answer. When the third generation arrives, they start asking questions. But if they're asking people who've only made assumptions about truth, those assumptions may not provide compelling reasons to believe. All this leads to our second heart posture. Help them see the why behind the what.
When Gen Z hears the Bible says sex is for a man and woman in marriage, they want to know why. Part of helping them trust the Bible's picture of reality is helping them see it reflected in real life. One way you might help them connect the dots is to introduce them to some chemicals in their brain, like oxytocin.
Help them understand that God designed this chemical to be released whenever someone has an orgasm, and that it creates a powerful bond between that person and whoever they were with when it happened. Then help them see that for a couple committed in marriage till death do us part, that bond is exactly what makes sense. It reinforces a culture of stability in the relationship, which also creates a healthy space to raise children. But for an unmarried couple, creating that oxytocin bond makes everything so much more complicated. And it can also make it harder to end a relationship that really does need to end. As Gary Thomas wrote in The Sacred Search, you're gonna feel like you want to stay with that person, even if you mentally understand that it's not a particularly wise match. You're literally launching a neurochemical war against your mental reasoning.
But let's be honest, even if you say all the right things, it doesn't mean our kids are gonna love the conversation. With our middle daughter, even though we had had small conversations with her leading up to it, at one point she did finally ask us, "Please just tell me where babies come from." So we sat her down and we told her everything. And at the end of this 10-minute awkward conversation, she stood up, looked at us and said, "I think I'm gonna hurl." At some point, your kids might respond to you the way ours did to us. But that doesn't mean we shy away from having the conversation.
Of course, many parents feel like it might be best if they just let someone else talk about sex for them. And Gen Z does need multiple adults speaking into their lives. So whether you're a parent, grandparent, teacher, youth pastor, or another caring adult, this content will be relevant for you. Still, we believe God has given parents a strategic position of influence in the lives of the next generation. According to Reggie Joyner at Think Orange, the average parent has around 3,000 hours of interaction time with their kids each year, compared to 40 hours a year with the average youth pastor. The parents' time pairs well with Common Sense Media's report that teens spend an average of 9 hours a day online, which also totals to around 3,000 hours a year.
Obviously, the 3,000 hours of screen time doesn't all involve hypersexualized media, but we're gonna see how that sort of media does shape this generation's sexual experience and how these factors affect the discussion around abstinence. A study from the Psychology of Music journal found that for the songs popular enough to make it into the top 40 charts, the percentage of hits overtly mentioning sex or sexual desire rose enormously over several decades, from 18% in the 1960s to 41.7% in the 2000s.
Now, we might expect a proportionate increase in sexual activity, but the actual story is more complicated. A 2-year survey of 16,000 students by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, found that only 41% of teens claim they've had sex, down from 47% a decade earlier. And the teen birth rate hit an all-time low in 2016, down 67% since its modern peak in 1991. As one article put it, today's teens love songs about the sex they're not having.
The question is, why? Is it because more frank discussions of sex are disenchanting it, taking away some of the appeal of the forbidden fruit? Maybe sometimes. Obviously, these stats aren't saying that no in-person sexual activity happens. And the lowered teen birth rate may be a reflection of more teens getting information about contraceptives from the internet. But as a general trend, Gen Z's sexuality is much more digitally mediated than was true for previous generations. As Gen Z learns to seek the fulfillment of their relational desires via the internet, they often learn the same lesson for their sexual desires. So while rates of pregnancy are going down, rates of porn use are going up.
According to the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, 64% of young people ages 13 to 24 actively seek out pornography weekly or more often. So 2 out of 3 are watching porn on a very regular basis. In addition to porn's addictive potential and all the ways it's been connected to the human trafficking industry, regular porn use also leaves us feeling less satisfied in our normal human relationships. It changes our expectations about what others should do for us. And one of the new expectations can involve nude photos.
About 27% of teens report receiving nude photos of other teens, and about 15% of teens report sending them. As one student told us, sexting is a normal part of a monogamous dating relationship. The rationale might be that in a pornified culture, teens feel like they have to do something that will allow them to compete with what's easily available on the internet. But then after that happens, 12% of teens report forwarding a sext to someone else without the subject's consent, and about 8% of teens report that their picture had been forwarded without their consent. The experiences of that 8% can be devastating and very difficult to come back from. Students need to be reminded of this as a real possibility when sexting.
But some students may not believe that they have a choice. We have a friend who works at a large private Christian school in Philadelphia where sexting had become an issue. She called a meeting with the high school girls and told them in so many words that if boys asked for naked pictures, they didn't have to send them. The response? A passionate round of applause from the entire room. Until that moment, apparently no one had told these young women that they didn't owe anyone access to their bodies, and that sexting is actually giving people access.
In a previous era, abstinence was the cultural pressure.
Don't have sex, because you will get pregnant and die.
And people rebelled by acting out sexually. But when the cultural pressure is to be sexually active ASAP, the whole conversation changes. All of this leads to the third of our 4 crucial heart postures. In a pornified culture, abstinence is agency. Instead of a cold mandate from on high, we have the opportunity to present the Christian sex ethic as a way to gain autonomy over and against the dehumanizing cycles our culture falls into. Christianity tells us that we were made for more than that, and that we have the right to not be determined by our environment. It tells us that we are God's image bearers, which means that that we have incredible dignity.
But of course, we're also human. We don't all perfectly live into our role as image bearers. And some parents may feel that certain decisions they've made have disqualified them from teaching Gen Z about sexuality. If that's you, we want to remind you that the gospel was never about us qualifying ourselves, but Jesus qualifying on our behalf and giving us his grace. Still, other parents may feel afraid that if they share their story, their kids may follow suit. But when my mom shared her story with me, that's not what I wanted to do. I understood why sex before marriage could be so harmful. And ultimately, those conversations made our relationship better too.
At Axis, we believe that what God calls sin, he calls sin because it ultimately will have detrimental effects on us if we choose to indulge in it. We also believe that the sooner parents can begin having these kinds of conversations, the easier it will be to build deep-rooted systems of truth in the hearts and minds of the next generation. Some studies land on age 8 as one of the average ages of first exposure to pornography. And because of that, we would argue that age 8 is a great age to start having these kinds of conversations around anatomy and sexuality.
But if your kids are already older and you've never really brought any of this up, but you'd like to, first of all, we want to applaud your desire. We'd encourage you to lead with vulnerability, even apology. If it rings true, you could say something like this: when I was growing up, my parents never really talked with me about sex, so that's what I took to be normal. But because of that, there were some things that I had to learn the hard way, and I want something better for you. So I'm sorry I haven't initiated much conversation with you about sex, but I want this topic to become something we can talk about without awkwardness or judgment.
The next generation needs you to fight through the awkwardness and start giving them guidance, because there's just too much to sift through alone. In our next video, we're going to look at our final heart posture and some of the LGBT questions that have become very relevant to Gen Z.